And we're live. I'm here with Lament. How you doing, man? Hello.
Wow. Sorry, I was trying to get the link so I could tweet it out, and I heard that intro thing playing twice, once on Twitter and once on YouTube. And it was an unpleasant experience. How am I doing? Other than that, I'm doing great. Great, excellent, amazing. How about you?
I'm doing good. A long day at work, but besides that, been good. I started reading "Liberalism is a Sin" by Father Fex. I can't pronounce that name, but it's a great book. Having a good time.
Cool. But I have never read that. I have heard of it. I've never read that book, so I certainly can't comment on it. Is it referring to like liberalism as the political ideology, or liberalism as like the heresy?
Political ideology.
Okay, cool. No, I'm sure that's interesting.
It's been described to me as James Burnham's Suicide of the West, but for Catholics.
Okay,
and so
cool.
I'm sure it's I've only read a few pages, but I've enjoyed what I've read.
Okay, cool.
And so I followed you on Twitter for a while, not knowing you had like a YouTube channel. I just liked your tweets, and so I followed. And then I found out you had a YouTube channel probably 2-3 months ago, and I just binged a lot of it. Really great stuff. Love how you are kind of a hub of a lot of great people.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a polite way of saying that I'm really lazy. And I like letting other people do my content for me. But thanks. Yeah.
I mean, the episode was covering Boss was been great. I think the best ones probably I've enjoyed have been like
I think that describes about half my channel.
That is true. The one when he debated Charlie Cook, that was the one I saw recently that I really enjoyed. I watched that debate as well when Voss and Charlie Cook debated on Tim Pool. And I can't remember who said it, but it was something about like you have 3 liberals: a centrist liberal, a left liberal, and a right liberal all debating. And it was like this spot on. The moment I heard him, like, yeah, that's exactly what Tim Pool, Charlie Cook, and Voss saw.
Yeah, no, exactly it. I mean, I'm critical of the entire mainstream conservative movement, even figures that I like. But I don't really like the sort of like super doomer mentality that some people get into, that they're, I don't know, it all just sucks, it's all useless, it's all fake, it's all pointless. And I never have subscribed to that. I have advocated selective and specific political abstinence before. That is, I mean, in particular, I have advocated in the last 2 Canadian federal elections not to vote for the Conservative Party. You can vote for one of the third parties if you want, or you cannot vote at all. But I can't imagine anything more destructive to any sort of authentic conservatism than voting for the Canadian Conservative Party.
Yeah.
But some people, I mean, this is something that Moldbug has advocated, is just complete political abstinence. And I've never agreed with that. I do have to admit there perhaps was a point when I was unsure if that might be a good strategy, but certainly it was something I never endorsed. And now certainly, I definitely, I think we all need to be willing to, take an L if it becomes clear. And if you're like a conservative in the traditional sense, and you're still sort of advocating for that, I mean, I'm not saying you have to like just vote for the Republicans whenever, or any vaguely center-right party. I do think selective political abstinence is good in certain circumstances. Example I've used before is I think it's definitely a good thing that Mitt Romney lost in 2012. And I think we'd probably be a much worse place if Mitt Romney won in 2012.
I can see that.
So I think selective political abstinence is good. But like, if you're a conservative Christian, if you think abortion is bad, it just kind of seems like a joke now to say like that. There's just nothing that can be done through mainstream politics with Roe v. Wade having been overturned. And I know that some people are going to say, oh, Roe v. Wade, it's always just abortion. It's always, you're always talking about this. But I mean, it's important, and this is I don't think I haven't been able to really give my take on Roe v. Wade publicly yet. So I guess we're getting that here.
Go right ahead.
But yeah. So I mean, I do not think it's an exaggeration to say that the overturning of Roe is the biggest political event, certainly in my lifetime. Probably in probably in the past 50 years. I certainly think that's of far bigger consequence than any other similar events we've had in the past 20, 30, probably 50 years.
I would agree. I think it's the biggest like right wing victory I've seen in my lifetime.
Yeah,
I'm only 23, so it's not made to count, but it still was a huge one to see.
Yeah, no, exactly. So just to continue to say that, like, I don't know, it's all just cringe. It's all just there's no possibility for enacting change. I mean, I do believe, it's not like I'm changing anything. I think everything I'm saying here is things I've said before. I'm more trying to disavow certain perspectives people have had that aren't quite as big brained and nuanced as my galaxy brain perspective on this has been.
You have a great way, I've noticed from your streams, a great way of talking in like the Gen Z style of like meme talk almost, with Galaxy Brain and Quinn's taking L's. It's fantastic. Like, I try to incorporate more like Zoomer speaking myself into like in the same for like an ironic, funny, but also on a young person thing. But you do it so it seems flawlessly and smoothly. It's like, yeah, Galaxy Brain. It's like, have you lived your life on the internet? You one of those guys who kind of like lived your life on the internet since you were born?
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, I'm a no, hopefully I haven't. But yes, I spend too much time on the internet. I have at certain points at least spent too much time playing video games. Actually, I don't think that's really much of a problem anymore for me.
Yeah.
Not to say that I have a great relationship with electronic media in general, but at least video games I don't think is something that I really have the same addiction to I perhaps did in the past. But yeah, no, I mean, I know I get mixed reviews on the humor, to say the least. I know it's just, it's as I always say on my channel, my audience is the stupidest audience in the world. So I try to ignore them. But no, I know. I like I said, I get very mixed reviews. Like I've had some people tell me that they think I seem overly polite, and I've had other people tell me that I seem like incredibly rude, with like calling my audience the stupidest audience in the world. I don't know. So I just have no idea how to take it when I get such conflicting reviews on stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I enjoy it. And it's just there's was it, you had 21st reaction on at one point. You have him on a lot because he's a.
Oh yeah, my minion. Speaking of which, actually, I had a very important announcement to make today regarding 21st reaction. I had requested that he come on here to be my minion, because he's my minion, and that's what I expect my minion to do. But he refused. He said he was unable to, and apparently just giving him a 1 hour notice wasn't enough. So I just wanted to say that he's being downgraded on the minion list, and I didn't really want Cringe Walker to come on, but I invited him on anyways, just to like see if he was a better minion than 21st, and he agreed to come on. So I mean, I told him that like I don't really need you. I just wanted to prove you're a better minion than 21st, so that's why he's not here. But I just wanted to publicly make it clear that for right now, Cringe Walker is at the top of the minion ranking, and 21st is below him currently. I mean, I do, to be clear, have more minions than just those two. Those are just sort of my chief minions. So 21st still is minion number 2. But before today, he would have been minion number 1 probably. So he's taken it down a rank.
That's good to know. Thanks for the update. So you're kind of in the whole neo-reactionary type space. Would you say?
No, I'm absolutely not. That's the most cringe. That's the most cringe label possible.
It really is. I can't think of a better one. I
have always, from the very moment of the inception of my channel, I have always used the same 2 labels: Catholic, just Catholic, not trad, not trad Catholic, not super holy heckin' based trad. Just Catholic and traditional conservative. Those are the only. I mean, I'm not saying over the. As I've said before, I was never a full on libertarian, but I was at least partially libertarian. I've heard all sorts of people summarize my political evolution in crazy ways. I remember some libertarians complaining about my anti-libertarian stuff, saying that I was an ex-Randist or Randite or whatever, Ayn Rand sport. I like many young men had a phase where I like read Atlas Shrugged and enjoyed it, but I wasn't I wasn't like an objectivist. I wasn't a disciple of Ayn Rand. I just read Atlas Shrugged once and enjoyed it. So people have summarized my my political journey in ways that I don't think are incredibly accurate. But no, for as long as I've had this channel, which about 2.5 years now, I think.
Mhm.
My primary political my primary political label, traditional conservative, has never changed. And my religious label has never changed. I'm just Catholic. I'm not trad. I'm not even a Vatican II Catholic, really. I guess it has changed. I've gone from Catholic to Vatican II Catholic. But that's just to antagonize the trads. But yes, no, certainly with political label from day one, the only political label I have agreed to use is traditional conservative. Now I understand that that's not incredibly satisfying because because I mean, so that can mean a lot of different things. Like sometimes when people say traditional conservative, they might think you mean like Bush conservative. That like you have new conservatives are like the MAGA conservatives, and then the traditional conservatives are like the 2000s conservatives. If that's what you mean, then that I'm obviously not that type of traditional conservative. Yeah. When I say traditional conservative, all I really mean is the historic Anglosphere conservative tradition. Even going beyond the Anglosphere too. But I have never disavowed Edmund Burke. I know that some people probably think Edmund Burke is cringe. I'm not saying Edmund Burke's great. I'm not saying he's perfect. But I still think he's an important figure in the Anglo conservative tradition. And I think there are other figures that are important, and there are non-Anglo figures that are important too. But I still firmly consider myself to be a part of the sort of very normal, at least historically speaking, mainstream conservative tradition. I don't consider myself to be a part of some sort of like weird fringe neo-medievalist, integralist, hyper-autism monarchy, internet, Jacobite, restorationist thing.
Some people's political labels get so autistic.
Yeah, I know. I can't remember who said this, but someone said once that political labels for right wingers is their version of pronouns.
I was literally about to say that. I was literally about to say, it's spot on. It's exactly the case. It's so traditional conservative. The only traditional conservatives I know of and really interact with is like two. One was a former libertarian, still an Austrian economics kind of guy, great dude on Twitter. The other ones are like the Michael Nose, Yuan Hazami, tradcons in America. Have you ever interacted with those kind of people, or like read any of their works, or like do you have a view of like the American Uzami like NatCon people, or are they just claiming traditional conservative, or are they actually traditional conservatives? Do you have any idea of what's going on in that circle over there? Or
yeah, so sorry, who was the first person you said?
It was like Michael Nose and Hizam Hazari. I think that's his name.
Yeah, okay, so I definitely know Michael Knowles. The other name rings a bell, but I don't remember him off the top of my head, so I won't comment on that. Yeah, I don't know. Are you familiar with the channel Reason and Theology?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan.
Yeah. So I'm sure you know that a meme on that channel is like the nuanced stuff. I feel like I'm like the galaxy brain, right wing nuance bro. Now that I'm just having to say like, oh, it's all just so galaxy brain, so nuanced. It's all requires all these different nuances to understand properly. Because I'm definitely very critical of Daily Wire in certain respects. Yeah. I certainly think that Ben Shapiro's vision of conservatism, I don't think he even really calls it that. I mean, he very explicitly says that he's a libertarian on like civil issues and economics.
And he's not even a good libertarian. He's like Chicago. It's like there are libertarians that are a lot of quins, but they're all good ones, like Austrian School, Mises Institute kind of guys. And he's like if he's a libertarian, he's like a Quins libertarian, or in the cringier ones at least.
So I don't like. I mean, he will often call himself a conservative as just sort of like shorthand. But I think he is actually quite honest in that he's not really a conservative. He's just like a libertarian that's socially conservative. And even there, like he has the terrible opinion on marriage that the solution to the left abolishing marriage is just to get the government out of marriage entirely. And this is, of course, an issue that I've been meaning to make a video on. I've sort of made a video on it in the past, but I feel like I could do another video on it. Is never submitting to the left's word games. It's very particular there when we talk about the left redefining marriage, to use the sort of boomer con phrase. it's very important not to play their games. Even using the phrase "gay marriage" should be avoided as much as possible, because it sort of concedes the idea that it's possible for two men or two women to be married in the first place, which it's just not possible. So I mean, personally, I prefer the phrase "the abolition of marriage." I think that's the best way to describe what happened. Redefinition of marriage is fine too, but the point is we really need not submit to the left's word games. But with Michael Knowles, so on one hand, the people that are running the company, Jeremy Boring and Ben Shapiro, are just liberals. It's like you said with that debate where it was just left-wing liberals, centrist liberals, right-wing liberals, no actual people that could be considered conservative or right-wing. Other than being a right-wing liberal, but that's I mean, yes, I do believe there's right-wing and left-wing liberalism. I don't deny that, but right-wing liberalism isn't really the right-wing tradition. It's just the liberal tradition, the right wing of the liberal tradition. But that's what people like Ben Shapiro and Jeremy Boring represent, is just right-wing liberalism. And I think it's very damaging to the conservative movement, and I think it's very bad. So on one hand, I've listened to Michael Knowles quite consistently for quite a while. I probably have watched the majority of the shows he's done on his podcast over the years. I currently listen to it quite regularly. And I think he's really good, and he's really on point, and he says stuff all the time that the vast majority of mainstream conservatives wouldn't say, in particular on this very issue of liberalism. He's said many times on his channel that he disavows the idea that conservatism is just conserving traditional liberalism. He has brought up that argument and disavowed it many times. He's always affirmed, or at least he's affirmed for a very long time now, for years, that that what he views conservatism as is completely separate from the liberal tradition. I mean, perhaps completely separate isn't the right term, but it's a firmly separate tradition from the liberal tradition. And he very often will say explicitly that the problems we're facing today isn't some like weird SJW blue hair feminist took control of like universities in the past couple of decades or something like that. He will say explicitly the problems we're facing today politically are root problems from liberalism. There are things that go back to John Locke. There are things that go back to traditional liberalism. They're not some sort of weird aberration on liberalism. That's not obviously. If you were to go back to John Locke, he had views that even I would find distasteful. He had views that would be considered far right by modern standards. But what I'm saying, and what Michael Knowles is quite correctly saying, is that the sort of trajectory of his belief and the sort of premises of traditional liberal beliefs are things that very easily and very naturally led to the contemporary problems that we have. So with that said, I really I really appreciate that, and I think Michael Knowles is making great points that that very few other people in the sort of mainstream conservative movement would make. But with that said, then he's working with like Ben Shapiro and Jeremy Boring, who epitomize in many ways the problems that he's discussing. Now, I mean, to be clear, sometimes. Again, being like galaxy brain nuance bro here, I want to be clear. Sometimes I will say sort of off the cuff that like Ben Shapiro is the worst of the worst when it comes to the conservative movement. That's not quite fair. I mean, he is very solidly pro-life. There are like Republican senators or at least there's Republican members of Congress that are just fully pro-choice. I think probably a few senators are pro-choice. But there are definitely many mainstream quote unquote conservatives that are pro-choice, that are just socially liberal. Like, I mean, Ben Shapiro is a religious Jew. Even though I think his solution to the marriage question is terrible, I'm sure that he believes what Judaism teaches about marriage and sexuality. I just think he has terrible political solutions related to those issues. So he isn't the worst of the worst. He isn't. I mean, David French isn't pro-choice either, but David French would be, someone who might be the worst of the worst of people who are still like actually personally conservative, still pro-life and stuff like that, but really just seem to want to have the worst political takes on everything possible. And I mean, Ben Shapiro is pretty bad, and so don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to run too much defense for him. I think it's important to clarify what point exactly I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
So the issue essentially with Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh, because Matt Walsh is quite good, though I wouldn't really say he's sort of like ideologically a traditional conservative. He's not really sort of into the same philosophical stuff that Michael Knowles is.
Mm-hmm.
But he is at least very dedicated to social conservatism.
Yeah.
And that's very nice. And he's made some really good impact with certain things recently. As we all know, with the documentary What Is Woman in particular, but other things too. But so I really appreciate what Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh are doing. But then it's always hanging over here where it's like they criticize this stuff all the time. I mean, from watching the Michael Knowles show, and I don't watch the Ben Shapiro show nearly as frequently, but I still watch it. Not that infrequently. Maybe once a week on average. There have been many times, so it's very obvious that Michael Knowles is explicitly sort of responding to Ben Shapiro, that Ben Shapiro will make points on some sort of controversy that's going on, and he'll make his sort of like right-wing liberal points, and it'll be very clear that Michael Knowles, I mean, maybe it's just that there's so many people making these points that he didn't necessarily explicitly realize this when he's writing the script. It just could be some other right-wing liberal made this point, and Ben Shapiro just happens to be echoing that same point. I don't know. But there's been many times when there'll be some controversy, and Michael Knowles, on the very same day that Ben Shapiro will make some sort of like cringy right-wing liberal point, Michael Knowles will make a point criticizing that exact same sort of interpretation that Ben Shapiro is giving. So I really appreciate that. But like I said, it comes back to, it's not just that like he's friendly with Ben Shapiro. It's not just that they're like friends. It's not just that they work together sometimes. It's that they work at the same company. They have the same political project. And that really just, it's not, again, I'm certainly not saying that I think Michael Knowles is lying or anything. I don't think he is. I'm sure he's sincere in his beliefs. It's just like, if these problems with liberal conservatism are such big problems, it would seem to me that you would need a different organization. You would need to clearly disassociate yourself from someone like Ben Shapiro. And it's even like, I appreciate a lot of the stuff Daily Wire is trying to do. I mean, I don't have a family, but one day I perhaps will. And I appreciate that they're trying to do children's entertainment that doesn't have left-wing messaging in it. I'm sure that's very difficult to find nowadays. So I appreciate that, and that very well could be something I could use in the future. So I understand why having sort of the resources pooled and stuff is useful. But still, ultimately, I guess it sort of comes down to my main criticism of Michael Knowles. And again, I'm not saying I don't have ideological disagreements with Michael Knowles. Also, I'm sure I do. But overall, he's so much better than most mainstream conservatives. I think it's kind of petty to point those out. I think the main issue is more sort of praxis, where even though I think the stuff he says is great, my main issue is that he says great stuff, but he's not really sort of clearly trying to differentiate himself within the conservative movement. And I really feel like that's going to make the sort of points he's trying to make lag in their effectiveness. As long as he's just sort of one of the other guys at Daily Wire.
Yeah, I've been watching a lot of Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh lately as well, and I enjoy Michael Knowles when he's right, he's spot on, I think, and it's very like when he gets it right often enough that it's enjoyable. When he gets something wrong, it's very frustrating because he's right so much of the time that when there's something he does that I want to disagree with, it's just so much more frustrating, because you're right like 80% of the time. It's just this one little window when he gets a few things off. But overall, I do think the Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh are probably the best of the mainstream conservative people that are out there right now. I can't really think of any other good mainstream political conservatives who are doing good work.
I mean, the American Mind publishes interesting stuff. I don't think they're super well known, but still they do interesting stuff.
Isn't that what's his name? Spencer Clavin. He writes for them sometimes.
He does. Yeah.
Spencer Clavin's a weird one. I really like his podcast, and I really enjoy his take on saying. I think he's way smarter than how to put this. His podcast when it comes like his history and like philosophy is really good, and he makes like political takes on Twitter or something that are also really good and spot on. And I wish he did something more like covering daily news, because he seems really good and really spot on with his takes and has a great philosophy behind him, with everything he says. He just seems to kind of avoid the daily political conversation, which is kind of sad. Cause I think he'd be a great addition to like the mainstream conservative right if he was actually in the mainstream dealing with the news and not just doing his side project with his history and literature stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not super familiar with him, so I mean, the stuff I've heard from him is he is normally pretty insightful, but I don't follow stuff enough to really comment much.
But so Twisted the Conservative. You mentioned Burke earlier, Edmund Burke.
Yep.
Now he's the guy who a year ago I said was cringe and I would never read him, and then I read him this year and I was thoroughly impressed. I actually enjoyed what I was reading. He's a figure. I think he's how would I say this? He seems to be well known but not ever talked about. Like I see people will talk about Burke and reference Burke, like they'll bring up his name, but they never actually seem to go deep dive into what Burke believed and actually talk about Burke in any meaningful way. Have you noticed that as well? Or?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I'm responsible here. I have had, to be honest, an ongoing problem with my channel in that my main obsession really lies more with the sort of religion nowadays than it does politics. But I don't feel like I have the expertise in religion to discuss it too much publicly. But yes, no, I've been wanting to do sort of like book reviews of sort of like, normal conservative classic stuff, Chesterton, Burke, etc. I've done that in the past. I did a live stream book review of Chartism. Just recently I did a live stream book review of Lament for a Nation, which that again, that Lament for a Nation is like a Canadian conservative classic. It's not like ultra neo-monarchist, terminally online, super autistic thing. It's just a very normal classic in Canadian conservatism, Lament for a Nation. I did do a live stream book review of that recently, and but yeah, certainly I have not done enough of that type of stuff that I would like to. I'd like to do more book reviews or more, discussing these types of sources.
That's literally all I do on this channel. Is that it's mainly a book club channel. I occasionally do an interview, but mainly I just find a book, get a guest, and we go deep dive into the book on a topic, on the issues of the book. I'm trying to find more conservative. I'm trying to find more books. Right now, all the books I'm doing is either Catholic or like, Uber, or like I'm trying to cover like Nick Land soon. I'm like, this is a guy who's just too out there. I need to go back and actually cover like more. I want to cover Chesterton soon. I'm doing a book from him Saturday.
I was supposed to do a review of Orthodoxy from Chesterton's like 7 months ago, around January, I think. But like that's one of many things I never got to.
Yeah. There seems to be, at least in my circles online, there are a lot of people who
for one of the questions in for one of the questions I see in chat, Pete Budapest says 21st reaction still a cringe evangelical. I really, as I said previously, with like people accusing me of having been a objectivist or something like that, I really just don't know where people get this stuff from. 21st I don't think 21st has ever been an evangelical. He, for the time that he has been my co-host, he has certainly always been Catholic. So I don't know where anyone and he's so I'm pretty sure he was never a Protestant, at least never a practicing Protestant.
Lucky him.
So I don't know where people just get this crazy stuff from. I don't know if he's thinking of someone different, but he's getting mixed up with 21st Reaction. I don't know, but 21st Reaction is definitely Catholic. And definitely has never been a evangelical for as long as his internet career has existed.
But I was saying, there seems to be a trend, at least I've noticed in my circles, of people who are going deeper, more into like political ideology, political thinking, reading older and deeper books. And when it comes to things like Burke or Chesterton or like traditional conservative ideas and stuff, they view those as normie ideas and then not worth engaging with. What I think is just dead wrong. If you read Chesterton, it may be popular, but it's nothing normie about it. It's ridiculously good. why do you have any idea why you think that might be? Why people kind of like move past what they would consider like, or why they would consider like Burke and just like normies and kind of move past that to what people like Land and Courtesy often and kind of
Yeah,
skip
I mean,
over people.
Yeah, I mean, I think one major issue is just that like someone like Burke is going to get cited a lot by the really cringy mainstream conservatives who have a lot of problems. That like any like member of parliament that wants to like sort of show like their credentials as being like a sort of like, you know, real conservative is going to be like, oh yeah, I was just reading like Edmund Burke the other day to like show how like galaxy brain they are and how like real conservative they are, how they definitely aren't a liberal. So, you know, and it, you know, again, I'm not saying that like everything in Burke is great. I'm just saying that I think it's a valuable and important part of the conservative tradition. I don't think that's sort of fundamentally flawed the way in the way that the sort of liberal tradition is. And even that, you know, I'm not saying that every aspect of the liberal tradition is wrong and bad. I would say that there isn't much I personally believe in that from that anymore. But yeah, so I think a big part of the issue is just that it's association. I mean, some, you know, would just be that people disagree that they're some people just do think that that tradition is fundamentally flawed and that they're part of a different tradition. That's fine. I mean, that's why, like I said, I'm just a traditional conservative. I'm not some sort of autistic internet ideology. If you're a part of a different ideology, if you think the conservative tradition for the past like 400 years has been fundamentally flawed, that's fine. I mean, I could even understand why someone could come to that conclusion. I'm just saying that that's not what I'm a part of, and I never have been.
Let's talk about political history here, political history a little bit. Like, how did you get into politics? What kind of got you making your YouTube channel? What's kind of like the whole Lament origin story kind of thing?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't like talking about personal stuff too much.
That's fine.
But yeah, I mean, so I'm mostly speaking generalities. But I've been obsessed with politics for a long time, as we've said multiple times. You know, that sort of standard, nerdy, hyper online, terminally online personality. I just, you know, at a young age when like other people were playing video games or like basketball or something, I was like listening to podcasts and radio show BoomerCon radio shows and stuff online. So yeah, I mean that's just how I sort of got sucked into it. I was originally a sort of BoomerCon. Then I was sort of a libertarian BoomerCon. To be clear, and I have always said this, I was never like a straight libertarian. I always had at least a bit of residual conservatism, and I certainly was always pro-life. I would say before becoming Catholic, I don't think I was ever fully pro-life. I mean, I was like 99% pro-life, but I think I always, I don't think I ever supported rape exceptions, but I do think I always supported like life of the mother exceptions for abortion. But still, you know, that was just a result of me not understanding one, what an abortion is properly, because abortion is never medically necessary, but also two, not understanding moral theology properly, or moral philosophies are not really moral theology. But yeah, so to be clear, I was never just like a complete libertarian, though I was pretty libertarian at one point. Yeah. And then I eventually got dissatisfied with that. And then that's when I gradually became more of a traditional conservative, more dissatisfied with sort of mainstream politics, more dissatisfied with mainstream parties, and very much dissatisfied with libertarianism. And I, you know, sort of like NRX and Moldbug has come up multiple times. Again, I have always, I looked this up recently. My interview that I did with relatively early on in my channel, the interview I did with Dormant Dynasty, the channel formerly known as the Asian Capitalists, which is a good interview, and I'd encourage everyone to check it out. But because I sort of get people like insinuating sometimes that they seem to think like I've changed, like I'm disavowing Moldbug or something. I'm not disavowing Moldbug. There's things I've learned from Moldbug that I thought were interesting and useful, and I'm not going to disavow that. But I've always said that I think there's incredibly deep problems with Moldbug. And I've always said that I'm not NRX because, one, the only NRX author I've really ever read is Moltbach. I've never read Nick Land. I hear people talk about him, never really have had any interest in reading something from a transhumanist. I can't imagine anything more opposed to Catholicism and transhumanism. I mean, perhaps that's rash judgment on my part, but
pretty accurate.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't know I haven't read his stuff, so perhaps he has Catholic compatible transhumanism for all I know. But it sounds pretty yikes to me. So it's not something I've ever had any interest in whatsoever. The only quote unquote NRX stuff I've ever been involved with is Moldbug, and really I'm not saying there are of course multiple takeaways I've had from that have been useful. I'm not saying this is the only thing, but really the main thing is elite theory, and elite theory isn't even like a right wing thing. Elite theory. Certainly, it's something that was developed a lot in the 20th century by Burnham, who is of course a right wing figure, but is also developed by far left figures too. So I don't think elite theory is something which is a specifically right wing phenomenon. I think it's something that really any. I mean, I would say that elite theory. It's hard to really square elite theory with liberalism. That I think is more the political bias of it. Is that it's sort of an intrinsically unliberal system, and that elite theory sort of the point of elite theory is sort of like dunking on liberalism. But so I think you either need to be like either a non-liberal leftist or a non-liberal right winger, really, for elite theory to make much sense. But beyond that, I don't think it's a specifically left or right wing thing, because elite theory has always been something that has had proponents on both the left and the right. And again, like Burnham's another example where he is someone who in these circles is usually thought of pretty positively. But like Burnham isn't like, again, like integralist, neo-monarchist, uber based, like crazy, like he's not some weird thing. He was more right wing than your average conservative, but he wasn't like super right wing. He wasn't he wasn't like some sort of weird esoteric Twitter blog of his day. He was ultimately a mainstream conservative. I mean, on the less mainstream side of mainstream conservatives, but he was still a mainstream figure.
Yeah, now, Burnham's fantastic. I'm rereading Suicide of West, and it's I think that's still probably one of my favorite political books. It's phenomenal. But yeah, I posted this on Twitter recently. I let people know I was going to be interviewing you, and I got some people wanting me to ask certain questions. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read off a few of the questions that were asked. People asked me to ask you. What is the role of the church in political governance?
The church. I mean, I don't know. It's not like I've read a lot of political philosophy. And I certainly do always want to be clear that, like, I'm not a priest. I'm not an authority in any sense. Unless I'm specifically citing from like a magisterial document, please do not take anything I'm saying as church teaching. And always, if you have any questions, ask your priest and obey your priest. Don't obey weird people on the internet. But with that said, I mean, I do think that the church has a role in sort of shaping society. Really ideally in Catholic societies, the church has had a very strong influence on the education system, and I think that still is ideal. Obviously, that's not really practical in most countries nowadays, but still, in a healthy society, I think the church would have a lot of influence over the education system. And I mean, that still exists to a certain extent in some countries. I mean, in Italy to this day, because of an old constitutional arrangement with the Vatican, you are still required to have 1 hour of religious education a week. And that's directly the result of the church's influence in Italy. So the church does still exercise that influence sometimes. But I mean, I would say ultimately that that any sort of like actual theocracy, as in like actually the church running society directly, is not really good, and that's not really the Catholic tradition. That it is good for the church to sort of lay down certain rules and lay down certain prescriptions of how society should operate. but it's not really the church's job to sort of micromanage society.
Yeah, I would agree. Next one. Do you have any views on Aquinas? Any particular views on St. Thomas Aquinas?
Yeah, I mean, he's great. I'm not like, I'm certainly not an expert on theology at all. I've read stuff from Aquinas. I read the Summa not irregularly when I have a question on something. I did that just a couple weeks ago, I guess, was most recently, where there was some issues I looked up in the Summa. So it's not super frequent. But still, he's great. I've always found him very useful. I guess also I recently have been reading some stuff on Thomist predestination that I've found very interesting. I read Father Gary Lagrange's book on the topic, and I also right now I'm always in the middle of reading multiple books. But right now one book I'm in the middle of reading is Taylor Patrick O'Neill's book on the intra-Thomist debate on predestination. And I found that very interesting also. So I'd say in Thomism, I guess the thing I'm most interested about right now definitely would be predestination. But I certainly, I'm not like an expert on it. I don't know nearly enough about like Thomism and Scotism and stuff like that to say which schools I think is the best and the most accurate. But certainly I think Thomas is great, and that there's and that ultimately you can't really go wrong with him.
You mentioned you normally reading multiple books. How do you put this? What is the books that you've read that you've really enjoyed and you're glad to have read, and you want other people to go out and read as well? What are some favorite books that you've read?
I mean, one book I already mentioned previously is Lament for a Nation, which is just an absolute classic in Canadian conservative history. Certainly, if you're a Canadian conservative, you have to read that book. It's just there. It is of really I don't think there's any other single book in Canadian conservative history that parallels its importance. And I'm not saying there aren't many other very important things in Canadian history, but it really just has a special place. And so certainly if you're Canadian, I think even if you're not a Canadian, the insights of Lament for a Nation are very helpful and very interesting. And he was reflecting on much broader processes, and that was always explicitly his intention, is that his lament for the problems of Canada in the 1960s, which he thought was fatal to the Canadian nation, George Grant being the author, the reason in particular he found this so depressing wasn't just because he thought it was the destruction of the Canadian nation, but because he thought it was the triumph of modernity, and that the destruction of the Canadian nation was just sort of one of the last dominoes in that triumph of modernity, and that the conflict between America and Canada was sort of a microcosm of that conflict between sort of traditional society and modernity. So certainly, I think that is a book which I think anyone could take a lot from. Again, I'm not saying I agree with everything in it. I don't. But I think it's an excellent book. I'd highly recommend it to anyone, especially if you're Canadian. But even if you're not, I think it's still very useful. In particular, the book you'll probably find on Amazon nowadays is, I think, like the 30th anniversary edition, which would have been from the 90s because the book was published in the 60s. But I think that's the 30th or 40th anniversary or something. Is the one you'll find on Amazon, and it has a very long introduction, as in like the introduction is about the same size as the actual book, because the book is quite short. It's only, I think, about 80 pages depending on your copy, and the introduction is almost exactly the same. But that's quite good. The author is clearly a liberal, and the author does sort of, or the author of the introduction to this updated version is clearly a liberal, and he does sort of disavow and criticize some of Grant's points. I mean, that's fine. That's not a big deal. I don't think he does it to an excessive degree. But the introduction is quite helpful, especially if you're not a Canadian, I would imagine, because the reason it's so long is it's trying to give you all the historical background for the stuff that you would just sort of be expected to have known in 1963 when George Grant wrote the book. So yeah, I mean, definitely that's that's one excellent book I'd highly recommend. Yeah, I mean, other books. I mean, Carlyle's Chartism is great too. I definitely would highly recommend that. Yeah, I mean, I that's about all I'll recommend for right now.
Sounds good. Good, both good book recommendations. They sound like. Let's go back a little bit earlier. We talked about, like, you mentioned mainstream conservatism. Do you have a particular favorite mainstream conservative, living or dead, who was something that you thought was really good but doesn't get talked about enough? Like a good mainstream conservative people kind of ignore because it was too normy or something.
I don't know. I can't really think of any off the top of my head. I mean, I guess, if we're talking about Canadian stuff, I do have I don't know if I would say this guy gets ignored. I don't think he really does in Canadian circles, but I definitely have a strong love for John Diefenbaker, even though he was a deeply flawed figure in many ways, but just as he was just sort of the heroic last stand of Canadian conservatism, which really authentic Canadian conservatism died with his defeat in 1963. There have since then conservatives have been more and less bad in Canada, but ultimately it's been Americanized at the very least. I would certainly plead ignorance over the exact beliefs of the leaders of the Conservative Party after the resignation of Diefenbaker, and until Joe Clark and Mulrooney, but certainly by the time we get to Mulrooney, the Canadian Conservative Party in the 1980s had been thoroughly Americanized. In particular, that we see the very divisions that divided the Liberal and Conservative Party in Canada in the first century of Canada have flipped completely on its head by the time of Mulrooney. Where, like, the central issue between the Liberals and Conservatives in Canada historically was tariffs, with the Conservatives being against them, or with the Conservatives being supportive of tariffs and with the Liberals being against them. And then in Mulrooney's second election, his second election was specifically on the issue of tariffs, with him being anti-tariff, and in particular supporting NAFTA, and with the Liberals and NDP being against the tariffs. Or with the Liberals and NDP supporting the tariffs. Sorry, I keep on mixing that up. So the sort of the traditional Canadian debate politically was completely flipped on its head. And that's just sort of a wider symptom of the thorough Americanization that the Conservative Party had gone over. And we have a leadership election right now for the Conservatives in Canada, and they're, some people are more conservative than others. I mean, the guy who's going to win, it looks like, is Pierre Poilievre. He's more conservative than most of the other figures, but they're all Americanized ultimately.
What do you mean when you say that exactly? I don't know. I don't know enough about, like, Canada conservatism or Canadian politics in general to understand what you're saying exactly. So
yeah.
what do you
mean?
I mean
when I say Americanized, one, I mean sort of like liberal conservatism. Now, of course, that's not even entirely faithful to the American tradition, as we've already discussed. But I do think it's more faithful to the American tradition than it is to the Canadian tradition. But it would also, again, when I say Americanized, I guess this would be the sort of classic Canadian right-wing trope of believing that America is a sort of fundamentally progressive nation. Which so this is a tricky issue. I really do not want to promote sort of self-hatred among Americans. I see sort of like right-wing internet Americans who like, oh, America sucks, I hate America. And I think that's super cringe. But with that said, I do think it's true that America has always been a explicitly Enlightenment project state. And this is something that I brought up on my most recent live stream discussing Lament for a Nation. Where in a book I've read recently, which I've been meaning to do a book review for my channel, an academic book on the history of academic intellectual anti-Americanism in Canada, or not academic anti-Americanism, just intellectual anti-Americanism. Most of the figures discussed are academics, but many of them aren't, or maybe not most, but many of them are academics. But they are all intellectuals, is what it's looking at, is intellectual Canadian figures and their opposition and anti-Americanism in them, which during the time surveyed in the book is an almost exclusively right-wing phenomenon. But basically, the way the author explains, and I think this is really an excellent analogy, is that the way that conservatives in Canada and in other non-American countries too often, viewed America was as a fundamentally ideological state in a unique way to other countries. In particular, the analogy he uses is that America was essentially viewed the same way that the Soviet Union was viewed during the communist period. Now, again, I don't want to annoy people. I don't want to try to. I'm not trying to just be like too edgy or anything like that. When I say that that America is an ideological state in the same sense as the Soviet Union, I'm not saying that means that America is as bad as the Soviet Union. I'm not saying that it has the same human rights abuses that the Soviet Union had. Obviously, that's not true. All I'm saying is that it's that it has been historically the same sort of ideological state. The ideology is obviously different. The history of that ideology and how that ideology has been imposed is obviously different. So I'm not trying to draw an equivalency of saying that like Stalin equals George Washington. That's obviously not true. But I do think that fundamental point of America being an ideological state is true.
I would agree. You mentioned earlier, and it's kind of a Quinn thing I've seen more of, like a lot of people who are kind of getting again more and more deep into like the political artist pronouns and bio for politics situation. They seem to become very anti-American or anti whatever your home country is, and they latch into some civilization like Roman times or the Byzantine, some other empire in the past. No, that's when it was good. We need to like reject all American because they become anti-patriot and anti-patriotism, and I sorely reject that. I mean, patriotism is a good thing, I would say. And,
yeah, I mean, I think it's just an extension of love of family, and love of your parents, that type of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like again, I love America. No one loves America more than me. I think there's a lot of good in America. So I don't want to come as like a super doomer or anything like that. But yeah. So I definitely think like I mean, yes, we get this in like multiple different autistic ways with some internet right wingers. One example would be the sort of Russophile crowd that sort of project their beliefs onto Russia and think that like Russia is the based savior of Western civilization, that's fighting a war in Ukraine to save the Ukrainians from gay marriage or something like that. This is obviously not true. And like the Russians have explicitly disavowed this. This didn't get too much traction, but like a month or two, or not a month or two, a couple months ago now, the Russian media explicitly, and this is state-run media. Not that I believe that Western media is really any more independent than Russian media. But that's not a compliment to Russian media. That's an insult to American media or Western media in general. But still, this is explicitly state-run media. So it's So I think that's important to keep in mind. And explicitly disavowing this, they explicitly by word disavowed the idea that Russia is this like based savior of Western civilization. This just obviously, and I mean to be clear, like I'm not saying that like I buy into like the most extreme neocon propaganda about Russia. I don't want war with Russia. I don't want World War III. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that America should invade Russia or that America should send boots on the ground to Kiev. I don't believe that. This is another really annoying thing, which makes me say that say like that my audience is the stupidest audience in the world. I remember someone on Twitter saying after I had posted some stuff making fun of some of the like lefty Ukraine virtue signaling or something like that. I posted some stuff making fun of that, or I can't remember exactly what it was. Something like that. And I had like someone in my comments on Twitter saying, "Oh, Settler, does this mean that you think Russia's based now or something?" After I'd done a video disavowing that concept, I was like, no, I again, this is I don't know why this is like galaxy brain 18-dimensional chess or something like this, but it is possible both to think that that warmongering from America would be bad, that it would be bad for America to get into a shooting war with Russia. That's bad. It's possible for the Russian invasion of Ukraine to be bad, and it's also possible for for a lot of lefty virtue signaling on Ukraine to be bad. All three of those things can be bad. Disavowing one doesn't require endorsing one or two of the others.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's one example of what you're talking about, is sort of projecting like Russia as being like the super based, and it's just like people just don't understand Russia at all. And again, I'm not saying that Russia doesn't lack a lot of problems that the West has. Obviously that's the case. Obviously, Russia is not bought into like LGBT stuff at all. Okay, that's good. I think that's bad. I mean, Russia did. I know I'm going to get people saying, "Oh, based," but like, okay, you're just a bad person. With what I'm about to say, that Russia like decriminalized spousal abuse recently. Like, that's not a good thing. I'm sorry. I know people are going to say, "Oh, that's so heckin' epic. I want to hit my wife." Like, I'm sorry. There's something wrong with you. Please, if you're Catholic and you think that's based, please ask your priest about this. You know, if this is an acceptable opinion. I really don't think it is. And I'm not, I'm not saying like, oh, like Russia decriminalized spousal abuse, so we have to like bomb Moscow. Obviously, I don't believe that. Obviously, I don't believe that like people that are, I don't believe like every bad thing someone says about Russia. I'm not saying there aren't, but all I'm saying is like Russia has extraordinarily high abortion rates. Russia has much lower church attendance rates than the West. I mean, even on the abortion thing, I mean, America, it now has abortion illegal completely in several states and has significant abortion restrictions in many other states because of Roe v. Wade, and the restrictions are only going to continue to get more extreme. In many ways, I think you can fairly say America is more conservative today than Russia is. Now, I'm not saying in many ways Russia isn't more conservative. I'm not saying there isn't a sort of like just generally socially conservative ethos in Russia. Yeah, certainly. And there's not going to be like anti-white racism in Russia, I'm sure. Yeah, sure. I'm not saying Russia isn't lacking a lot of problems that the West is having. All I'm saying is like sky high abortion rates, incredibly low church attendance rates, another thing, massive alcohol dependence. I know I'm going to have like trads telling me that alcoholism and smoking is based, but I'm sorry, it's not. It's not good. It's not based. I know some people get annoyed with me, sort of fantasizing about prohibition and stuff. That's like partially a joke. But that's besides the point. Whether or not we should ban recreational alcohol use is beside the point. The relationship that Russia has with alcohol is clearly not good. Whatever your broader opinions on alcohol, on recreational alcohol abuse or recreational alcohol usage, it is. So it's just Russia is really a country that has a lot of problems. Again, I'm not saying that the West doesn't have a lot of problems. The West has a lot of problems too. But it's just, again, sort of this projection of like things are bad here, so like this must be the base tone. I think the main problem here, this is something I meant to do a video on, but I never did. I think the main problem is that people want to is that people aren't black-pilled enough. They want to be able to imagine that there's right-wing Wakanda somewhere. That there's somewhere they can go that won't have any of these problems. When the problem is the whole world's been destroyed by modernity. There's no getting out of it yet, at least. It's going to take a lot more. There's nowhere we can flee. I'm not saying there aren't certain places that have less problems, but these are ultimately global problems. These aren't problems that you can flee anywhere. And yeah, this is why people get like super obsessed with, like you said, like the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. I'm not saying history is fine. I'm not saying getting obsessed with those just as like historical curiosities. Getting it. I mean, and not doing that. I mean, I want to say, be clear, this isn't just like a hobby. Like understanding history can be very useful. Practically, it can be very useful for politics. But a sort of like obsession with it to the point of like trying to live vicariously through past states.
Yeah.
And you get this on the left too with stuff like the Soviet Union, sometimes from tankies, or people are nostalgic for pre-Stalin Soviet Union. I think sort of the issue here, I think a major issue which has not been discussed enough is the thing that drives a lot of people to dissident politics, whether it's non-mainstream right-wing or non-mainstream left-wing politics, is being severely mentally ill. So I think the problem people have is they're severely mentally ill. They might be autistic, they might be depressed, they whatever they might have ADHD, whatever the problem they have, they've always just sort of felt like an outsider. So then they get into politics. And then politics seems to sort of provide an answer for it. It's like capitalism is the reason you feel bad, or like liberalism, or any of these issues is the reason you feel bad. So then you can like look at history, and you can find some state that you think is based, whether you're a left winger or right winger, and then you can say that, well, this place, this time didn't have these problems. So the issues I'm having, it's not because I'm autistic. It's not because like I'm terrified of talking to women. The issues I'm having is because I'm is because like I don't live in like the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah, I think everything you just said is 100% spot on. That was awesome. One more question. Earlier you talked about Enlightenment. You mentioned the Canada conservative tradition was more saw America as an Enlightenment experiment. Would you say that a traditional conservative should be anti or pro Enlightenment, or is that really just like a Canada America difference in the conservative traditions?
No, I mean I certainly think that to really be like traditionally conservative, you have to at the very least be very skeptical of the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. That again, when I so other figures, I guess going straight to like Burke might be a bit unfortunate, because really when I say I'm a traditional conservative, I mean like Aristotle, I mean like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, all these great figures that that might not be figures you immediately think of when you think of sort of political philosophy, but really that's just because back then there was no this wasn't it wasn't quartered off into the specific realm of political philosophy. So these are all these sort of great figures of Western civilization are all figures that that don't really work entirely well with the Enlightenment. So it's not, I'm not saying that nothing good ever came out of the Enlightenment. But I do think a skepticism of the Enlightenment is required. And I mean, this is something that Michael Knowles, again, to his credit, has explicitly talked about. So yeah, I don't think that just a sort of full throttle endorsement of the Enlightenment is compatible with traditional conservatism.
Awesome. I would agree. Well, we've been going for an hour. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for coming on. Any final words? And if there are no final words, what are your plugs? Where can people find you at?
Yeah, I mean, my channel is Settlers Lament. Just youtube.com/Settlers Lament, all one word, no punctuation in that, just the letters. I'm on Twitter too. I have a Discord also. So any of those three things are really the main things I do. I'm not going to ask you to donate because I don't feel like I'm making enough content right now to ask people to donate. But yeah, no, I mean, really, check out my Discord. I like my Discord. If you're, for anyone watching, if you're not severely autistic to the degree that you can't follow my rules, please check out my Discord. And also, everyone, most importantly, the most important thing to plug is, please go to my Twitter, find my tweet that says 1 like equal 1 hot take, and please give that an additional tweet. It's an extraordinarily important thread. The takes I've had under that tweet, I think they're so fascinating, so enlightening, so just mind opening, mind bending, that I will probably have to make a video just reading all of the takes, just so they can be immortalized in that way. So people can fully understand the great hot takes I have given on Twitter recently. So that's really the most important thing to show, is to like that.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I mean, I imagine there'll be some people watching this who came here from my channel. So perhaps it would have been useful to do this at the beginning, but since that's not an option now, perhaps you should describe your channel briefly for any people that have come here from me.
No. Just a former libertarian, kind of non-ideological Catholic. I just do a lot of book clubs. Domestic philosophy, political history, politics. You name a fiction, Tolstoy. You name a book. I'll probably eventually end up covering on the podcast. 'Cause I love reading books, and so I find a book and I find a guest. We do like an hour to an hour and a half long podcast, just going through the book in detail and trying to explore the book. Because I don't think not enough people read, and if they all read, they're not reading the right books. And so I'm just trying to make some more people can find out about great books. And if they don't have the time to read them themselves, I want to try to give them a Cliff Notes version of the book, but in a condensed podcast. So that's what I try to do over here.
Cool. That sounds really good. I have not listened to your channel at all, but I'll have to check it out.
Sounds good. Thank you, man.
Oh, yes. Most importantly, pray for me, everyone.
Will do. What's been another episode of Face, Liberty, and Praxis? This is season 2, episode 14. Like, comment, share, subscribe. The whole YouTube 9 yards saying I gotta say it. It's YouTube. If I don't say it, they take the video down. It's kind of how it works on here. Anyway, you guys have a good night. Read more books.